My grandpa had always been a quiet man, not the kind of quiet that draws attention, but the kind that settles like dust in the corners of a room, unnoticed but persistent. Growing up, I never thought much about it. He smiled softly, nodded when I talked, but rarely spoke about anything beyond the everyday. Family gatherings were filled with chatter, laughter, and stories. Everyone shared memories, achievements, jokes, and even secrets. But Grandpa, he stayed silent, like a shadow at the edge of the firelight. Sometimes I wondered what thoughts lived behind his calm eyes. He was a tall man, stooped slightly with age, his hands marked by time and labor. His skin was weathered, telling tales his lips never would. He wore simple clothes, well-worn sweaters and trousers, and a fedora he never took off completely, as if holding on to some invisible thread from his past. Despite his silence, the family loved him fiercely. He was our quiet anchor. When my parents argued, he remained a peaceful presence in the room. When I struggled with schoolwork or heartbreaks, he sat beside me without words, offering comfort in his calm company. But there was one question that always hovered in my mind, unanswered and heavy. What happened to him during the war? My grandpa had fought in a war that left scars deeper than skin. He never volunteered stories, not about the battles, the comrades lost, or the days when fear was the only thing certain. He'd shake his head or smile faintly whenever someone brought it up. "Those days are behind me," he'd say, voice low but firm. I respected his silence, but couldn't help feeling a pull toward the mysteries it held. I was curious about the man behind the quiet. Who was he before the war? What had he seen? And more importantly, what had he done that he never talked about? One summer, when I was 18, everything began to change. Grandpa and I were alone on the porch one warm evening. The sun was dipping behind the trees, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. Crickets chirped lazily as the day slipped into night. I had been working up the courage to ask, and finally I did. "Grandpa, can you tell me about the war? About what you did?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out toward the horizon, eyes reflecting the fading light. "I didn't want to talk about it," he said quietly. "Not because it was easy, because some memories, some stories, they're hard to carry." I nodded, not wanting to push, but he surprised me. "Maybe it's time you knew," he whispered. That night, as the stars blinked awake above us, Grandpa began to tell me a story he had kept hidden for decades. It was a story about a stranger, a young soldier, lost and wounded, someone my grandpa had saved during the darkest days of the war. It was a story about courage, sacrifice, and a bond forged in the fire of battle. And it was a story that would change everything I thought I knew about him, and about the quiet strength that had shaped our family. The next evening, I sat down beside Grandpa with a notebook and pen, ready to listen. The porch light flickered gently, casting soft shadows across his lined face. He took a deep breath and began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of memory. It was 1944. The war was raging all over Europe. I was part of a small unit tasked with holding a hill on the front lines. The fighting was fierce. We were outnumbered, tired, and the nights were filled with the sound of gunfire and cries. He paused, eyes distant. One day, during a reconnaissance, I spotted a young soldier, barely more than a boy, crawling through the mud, clutching his leg. He was enemy, but wounded, alone. Grandpa's hands clenched around his mug. Most would have left him. We had orders to retreat, but something in me, I couldn't. I dragged him back to our trench, despite the risk. He told me how the boy was barely conscious, whispering in a language Grandpa barely understood. He cleaned the wound with trembling hands, sharing what little water and food he had. "Our commander was furious when he found out," Grandpa said, voice dropping. "He said I was risking the whole unit for a stranger, but I couldn't just leave him to die." The boy, whose name Grandpa only learned later, survived because of that choice. But it changed everything for Grandpa. He said the war stopped being about orders or sides. It became about the people, the ones fighting, suffering, hoping for a chance to live. The moment Grandpa chose compassion over duty was the moment he stopped being just a soldier. He told me about nights when the boys' pain kept them both awake, about whispered conversations neither understood but both needed. That secret bond, forged in the mud and blood of war, stayed with Grandpa for years, a silent echo beneath his quiet exterior. As he finished, the porch fell silent except for the wind in the trees. I realized then how much courage it had taken to carry this story alone for so long, and how much it meant that he chose to share it with me now. After that evening, Grandpa and I spent many afternoons on the porch, where he unraveled more memories, piece by piece. Each story brought me closer to the man behind the silence, a man shaped not just by war, but by the quiet acts of kindness that defined him. He told me about the days following that fateful rescue. The boy, whose name was Emil, had been a soldier from the opposing side, young and scared like many others. Despite their differences, they found ways to communicate. Grandpa learned some words of Emil's language. Emil picked up English phrases. Their shared will to survive bridged what war had torn apart. Grandpa recounted how they hid in the trenches for days, sharing stories about their homes, families, and hopes for peace. They became unlikely brothers in arms, connected by the raw vulnerability that war exposed. One afternoon, a firefight broke out nearby. Grandpa and Emil had to stay perfectly still, barely breathing, as bullets whipped past. The tension was suffocating. In those moments, Grandpa's calm exterior masked a storm of fear and determination. He was fighting not just to survive, but to protect the boy who had come to mean more than just a rescued stranger. Despite the danger, Grandpa's compassion never wavered. "I had to believe that saving one life was worth every risk," he told me, even if no one else understood. As days passed, the war moved on, and so did Grandpa's unit. He made the heart-wrenching decision to leave Emil behind, hidden in a small cave he had discovered. They exchanged a final look, a silent promise to survive and remember. Grandpa never saw Emil again, but the memory stayed with him, a constant reminder of what humanity could endure and what it could never lose. Hearing these stories, I began to understand the heavy burden Grandpa carried all those years. The war wasn't just about battles and strategy. It was about moments like this. The choice to be kind, to risk everything for another human being. Over time, I noticed subtle changes in Grandpa. The silence that once seemed impenetrable now felt more like a protective shield, worn by a man who had lived through unimaginable pain. I also saw the war's impact in other ways. The small scars on his hands, the distant look in his eyes during quiet moments, and the way he sometimes flinched at sudden noises. One afternoon, while we were working in the garden, I asked him, "Did saving Emil change you?" He paused, digging his hands into the soil. "It did," he said softly. "It reminded me who I was beneath the uniform, that even in darkness there's light if you choose to see it." This revelation deepened my respect for him. Grandpa was not just a war hero in the traditional sense. He was a man who chose mercy when it mattered most, a lesson that stayed with me as I faced my own challenges. Those days of sharing stories created a bond between us stronger than words. Grandpa's silence had once felt like a wall. Now it was a bridge, one built on trust, courage, and love. As the days passed and Grandpa's stories unfolded, a shadow began to settle over our conversations. The past was never just memories. It was a weight he still carried, sometimes pulling him back into the darkness he had tried to leave behind. One afternoon, while we sat quietly in the living room, I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his cup of tea. His usually steady gaze flickered with something I hadn't seen before: pain, fear, perhaps guilt. I asked gently, "Grandpa, is there something more you want to tell me?" He hesitated, swallowing hard. "There is," he finally admitted. "Not everything about that time is a story I'm proud of." He revealed that during one of the last battles, after leaving Emil behind, he was forced to make a terrible choice, a decision that haunted him for decades. His unit was ambushed, surrounded on all sides. Orders came down to retreat, but there was a wounded soldier trapped behind enemy lines. It was either leave him to die or risk the entire group's safety to try to save him. Grandpa chose to save the soldier, but in doing so, many others were caught in the crossfire. Several of his closest friends were lost that day. "The guilt, it's a heavy burden," he confessed. "I saved one life, but lost many others. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice." His voice cracked, eyes glistening with unshed tears. I could feel the deep conflict tearing at him, the weight of survival intertwined with the cost of loss. The war was never black and white. It was filled with impossible decisions and lasting consequences. This revelation changed my understanding of Grandpa's silence. It wasn't just pain or fear. It was regret and sorrow, hidden behind his calm demeanor. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that what he did was brave and human, but words felt inadequate against such profound anguish. Instead, I listened. He told me about the nights he spent awake, haunted by memories of those lost friends, how he had written letters he never sent, filled with apologies and unspoken goodbyes. He spoke of the loneliness that followed him home, the feeling that no one could truly understand what he had endured. Despite everything, Grandpa continued to serve in peace, dedicating himself to helping others, quietly making amends in the only ways he knew how. Hearing this, I realized how much strength it took for him to carry such a burden silently for all those years, and how much courage it took to finally share it with me. Our conversations grew deeper, more honest. The walls Grandpa had built around his past began to crack, revealing a man shaped not only by war, but by his relentless humanity. But the weight of his memories was still there, reminding us both that healing is not a simple journey. As I looked at him, I understood that this story, his story, was not just about what he had done in the war. It was about the long road afterward, the fight to find peace within himself. And I knew that if he could face those ghosts, so could I. The weeks after Grandpa's confession felt different. The stories no longer weighed on the silence between us but sparked something new, a shared determination to find meaning in his past. One afternoon, as we sifted through old boxes in the attic, we uncovered a bundle of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon. Grandpa's hands trembled as he untied them, his eyes scanning the fragile pages. "These," he said softly, "are letters Emile wrote to me after the war." I was stunned. After all these years, a connection to that stranger had survived. The letters told of Emile's life after the war, how he had recovered, returned home, and struggled to rebuild a life shadowed by the memories of battle. He wrote of gratitude for Grandpa's bravery and kindness, calling him a brother in a world that had tried to tear them apart.